The words hit the courtroom like a slap. Your Honor, the plaintiff's niece is a woman with no verifiable stability, no discernible career, and a documented history of psychiatric instability. My client submits that a man of Walter Calloway's advanced age and diminished judgment could not have freely chosen to leave his entire estate to a woman incapable of managing her own life. I sat very still. My hands were folded in my lap, the way I'd been trained to hold them during a debrief when the truth in the room was heavier than anyone wanted to admit. Across the aisle, my uncle Gordon Calloway sat with his chin lifted, his tie a little too bright for a civil proceeding, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth like he already knew how this ended. His lawyer, a man named Preston Duke, paced in front of the bench with the confident swagger of someone who had never once lost. We have medical records, he continued, referencing a hospitalization. We have no employment verification beyond a government pay stub that lists nothing but a numbered division. Your Honor, this is not a woman entrusted with a legacy. This is a woman who needs to be protected from herself. I heard it before I felt it. The small involuntary breath my lawyer, Sarah Wynne, let out beside me. Not defeat. Patience. Sarah had known me for 11 years, since law school roommates who used to split a single space heater in a Georgetown apartment we couldn't afford. She knew exactly what was sitting in the folder in front of her, and she knew exactly what Preston Duke did not. Your Honor, Sarah said, rising, her voice even and unhurried. Before we proceed to closing arguments, the defense would like to enter one additional exhibit into evidence directly responsive to opposing counsel's characterization of my client's stability, her honesty, and her fitness to inherit. Judge Marcus Whitfield, a broad-shouldered man in his 60s, with reading glasses perched low on his nose, had spent the last 40 minutes with the particular stillness of a man who had heard this exact argument, in one form or another, 100 times before. The aging patriarch, the surprise air, the accusations of manipulation dressed up as concern. I imagine he'd already half-written his ruling in his head, the way judges do when a case starts to feel routine. He waved a hand. Proceed, counsel. Behind me, I could hear my Aunt Patricia whispering something to my cousin, the two of them exchanging the small, satisfied glances of people who believed they already knew how this story ended. Gordon caught my eye across the aisle and gave me the same look he'd been giving me since I was 12, pity wrapped around contempt, like he was doing me a favor by even bothering to despise me. Sarah didn't reach for a file box. She reached for a single manila folder, thin, unremarkable, the kind you'd find in any office supply drawer. Inside it was a certified copy of a Department of the Army Personnel Action, the kind that gets typed up, signed, stamped, and mailed to a family only after the sealed ceremony room has already emptied out. The bailiff carried it to the bench. Judge Whitfield opened it. I watched his eyes move down the page. He stopped. Read the line again. His jaw, which had been set in the practiced neutrality of a man who has heard 10,000 estate disputes, went tight. He looked up, not at Sarah, at me. Major Calloway, he said. The room didn't gasp, not audibly, but I felt the air pressure shift, the way it does right before a storm breaks over open water. Gordon's head snapped toward me so fast I heard his neck crack. What? He said. What did he just call her? Judge Whitfield closed the folder gently, like it might bruise. This document, he said, addressing the room now, not just counsel, is a certified DD Form 214 and an accompanying Army Public Affairs release confirming the recipient's rank decorations and record of service, including the Purple Heart and the Silver Star for actions during a hostile engagement in 2019. He paused. It is a public record. It has been public for 6 years. Nobody in this room bothered to look. That was Gordon. A small strangled sound, like a man who has just realized the floor he's been standing on was never there. Preston Duke's mouth opened and nothing came out. Sarah sat down beside me, calm as ever, and under the table she found my hand and squeezed it once. I didn't squeeze back. I didn't need to. My victory, if you could call it that, had never been loud. It had been sitting quietly in a government records office in St. Louis for 6 years, waiting for someone to bother asking. To understand how we got to that folder, you have to go back 3 months, to a lawyer's office that smelled like burnt coffee and old carpet, on the day my grandfather's will was read. Gordon had worn his good suit to the reading. I remember that detail specifically because he'd made a point of mentioning it in the parking lot. You dress for the outcome you expect, he'd said. adjusting his cufflinks like a man rehearsing a victory speech he hadn't earned yet. The room smelled like burnt coffee from a pot that had been sitting too long on a warmer, and somewhere down the hall a fax machine kept trying and failing to connect. My mother sat 2 chairs down from me, twisting a tissue into a tight rope in her lap, still raw from the funeral 3 weeks earlier. My Aunt Patricia and her husband had taken the good chairs near the window. Blake sat beside his father, scrolling through his phone with the bored confidence of a man who considered this meeting a formality, standing between him and lunch. The attorney, a soft-spoken older man named Mr. Feldman, who had handled Calloway family business for 3 decades, read through the wills clauses in the flat. Practiced tone of someone who had delivered 1,000 of these readings and learned to keep his face empty no matter what was inside them. The liquid assets, including the brokerage accounts and the proceeds of the Calloway construction buyout, are to be divided as follows. Mr. Feldman read, and then the numbers came, and Gordon's legs started bouncing under the table with poorly contained excitement. It went to him. All of it, exactly as he'd expected, exactly as he'd been telling his golf buddies for years it would. A small, satisfied smile crossed his face. Then Mr. Feldman turned the page. The property located at 4417 Winslow Ridge Road, including the main residence, the guest house, and the surrounding 11 acres, is left in its entirety to my granddaughter, Renata Calloway. The silence lasted maybe 2 seconds before it broke apart entirely. What? Gordon was on his feet so fast, his chair skidded back and hit the wall. No, that's the house, that's the estate. That land alone is worth. He caught himself, but not fast enough. Everyone in the room had already heard the greed finish his sentence for him. He turned on me like I'd personally reached into his pocket. You, he said, jabbing a finger in my direction. You did this. You've been, what, sniffing around him, telling him stories, working some kind of angle while the rest of us were building actual lives? Ugh! I remember making a small sound, not quite a word, because there was nothing I could say that wouldn't come out sounding exactly like what he already believed about me. You live in some apartment doing, what is it again? Filing paperwork for the county? His voice climbed. You have no house, no husband, no title, nothing to show for 34 years on this earth, and now you expect this family to believe Dad just decided to hand you 11 acres out of a clear blue sky? He was old. He wasn't thinking straight. You took advantage of a dying man. I sat there with my hands in my lap, the same way I'd sit 2 months later in that courtroom, and I said nothing. Not because I had nothing to say, because everything I could have said was classified, or close enough to it that the habit of silence had become permanent scar tissue. Gordon mistook my silence, the way he always had, for guilt. I'm contesting this, he said, his voice shaking now at something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief either. Something closer to the panic of a man watching a number in his head shrink in real time. I'll see you in court. Undue influence, incompetence, the whole thing. I'll prove to everyone exactly what you are. He had no idea what he was about to prove instead. To understand the 2 lives I was living, you have to understand what Thanksgiving looked like in the Calloway family, because Thanksgiving was where the family narrative about me got written and re-ratified every single year. Like a contract nobody remembered signing but everybody kept enforcing. Gordon would stand at the head of the table with a glass of wine raised too high, like he was presenting an award. A toast, he'd announce, and the table would quiet obediently. To Blake, who just made regional sales manager at 28. Not bad, huh? Applause. Genuine applause, warm and easy, because Blake's success was the kind everyone understood. A title, a raise, a new car in the driveway that everyone could see and admire. Then, like clockwork, the spotlight would swing to me. And it never swung there for a good reason. Gordon would lean over, pat me on the head like I was a golden retriever that had just failed to catch a frisbee and say to the table, "And Wren's still over there doing her little desk job for the government, right? Filing or scheduling or whatever it is." He'd chuckle, and the table would chuckle with him, not because it was funny, but because laughing along was easier than asking what I actually did. Don't worry, sweetie. Someone's got to answer the phones. That knot would tighten in my stomach, the old familiar one. The one that had been tightening since I was 19 years old and came home on leave and realized my own family had already decided who I was before I'd said a single word. One year, I tried, just once. Actually, I said, and my voice came out quieter than I wanted it to. I was frocked to major last month. Gordon blinked at me like I'd spoken a foreign language. Frocked? It means I'm serving in the rank and performing the duties before the official date of rank paperwork catches up, I said. It happens when the Army needs someone in a position faster than the promotion board timeline allows. He stared at me for a full 3 seconds. Then he threw his head back and laughed, a big theatrical laugh that pulled the whole table in with him. Frocked. Sounds made up. Did you get a certificate? A little pin? He turned to Blake, grinning. Meanwhile, this one's running a whole sales district. I looked down at my plate and didn't say anything else that year, or the year after. Gordon's picture of my life was a beige cubicle under fluorescent lights, a coffee mug with a motivational cat on it, a stapler I guarded with petty office politics. The truth was a sensitive compartmented information facility with no Windows humming servers and a wall of monitors that never went dark, where I spent most of my days cross-referencing signals intelligence with troop movement reports for a military intelligence battalion supporting a special operations task force overseas. My actual desk job, the one Gordon mocked at every holiday table for a decade, had put me on a medevac flight out of a forward operating base with shrapnel in my hip after I refused to leave a position until the intelligence picture I was building got relayed to the ground commander. It was the reason 2 squads made it home instead of walking into an ambush that had already been staged and waiting. None of that was secret. Not really. It just wasn't something I'd learned how to say out loud at a dinner table that had already decided I was the family's footnote. I remember the exact moment the picture changed for me, professionally speaking, not the family dinner table, the real one. The one that actually mattered for the story that was coming. I was standing in an operations center outside Kandahar, staring at a wall of chatter that didn't add up. This traffic on the secondary net is a misdirect, I said, pointing at a cascade of low-priority signal noise. They want us looking at logistics movement in the north. It's noise. Lieutenant Colonel Diane Okafor, my battalion commander, a woman built like she'd been carved out of granite by someone in a hurry, stood behind me with her arms crossed, saying nothing, watching the way she always watched. Like she trusted the analysis more than she trusted her own instincts because she'd learned the hard way that instincts lie, and data, if you read it right, mostly doesn't. I pulled up a second, thinner thread of encrypted traffic buried underneath the noise. The real coordination is here. This is timed to a checkpoint rotation. If that convoy leaves at 0600 like scheduled, it's driving into a prepared ambush. Okafor stared at the board for 10 long seconds. Then she nodded once, sharp. Get the convoy commander on comms. Now, reroute. The convoy rerouted at the 0530. Nobody in that vehicle formation ever knew how close they'd come to a very different morning, and nobody needed to. That was the job. No parade, no toast at a dinner table. Just a quiet nod from Okafor in the knowledge that people were going to get to go home because you did your work right. That wasn't the call that put me on a medevac flight, though. That one came 4 months later in a smaller outpost near the border. During what should have been a routine assessment of a partner force checkpoint, I'd flagged an anomaly in local pattern of life reporting 2 days earlier. Foot traffic near the checkpoint had shifted in a way that didn't match any seasonal or market explanation I could find, and the shift correlated, when I laid it against a separate signals feed, with movement I'd seen before 3 weeks prior in the hours ahead of an IED emplacement 40 kilometers south. I raised it. Nobody above me dismissed it outright, but nobody moved fast enough either, and I remember the particular helplessness of watching a report climb slowly due channels while a clock I couldn't see kept ticking somewhere out past the wire. So I did the thing you're not supposed to need to do if the system is working the way it's designed to work. I got on a vehicle headed to the checkpoint myself, to walk the ground and confirm what the data was telling me before anyone signed off on standing down the alert. I was right. That was the small cold comfort of it afterward. I was right, the checkpoint rotation was compromised. And the squad on duty that morning got pulled back 20 minutes before the device that had been buried under the gravel apron was meant to go off. I was 70 meters away when it detonated anyway, triggered early by a nervous trigger man who'd seen the vehicles turning back and panicked. Shrapnel took me in the hip and the outside of my thigh. I don't remember much of the immediate aftermath, except the strange, detached clarity of lying on gravel, looking up at a sky the color of old dishwater, thinking with what felt like enormous importance at the time, that I needed someone to confirm the checkpoint had actually been cleared before I let myself lose consciousness. It had been. Nobody in that formation was killed. I woke up 2 days later in Landstuhl, with my grandfather's hand wrapped around mine, and the first thing I remember him saying, once he was sure I could hear him, was, "You did good, kiddo," whatever it was. I don't need to know what, I already know you did it right. 3 months after I was back on my feet in a plain conference room with no cameras and no press release, a 2-star general pinned a bronze star with Valor device on my chest alongside the Purple Heart, and told the 6 of us in the room that none of it would ever appear in a hometown newspaper, and that was exactly how it was supposed to work. I went home for Thanksgiving 4 weeks after that, still favoring the leg a little when I walked, and got a pat on the head for my little cubicle job. There were other Thanksgivings, other dinners, and they all bled together into the same shape over the years. There was the year Gordon's company won a ribbon-cutting contract for a new county building, and he brought the local paper's clipping to dinner, passing it around the table like a religious relic. While I sat there having just come back from a rotation, I couldn't discuss my hip, still aching in cold weather from a scar nobody at that table knew existed. There was the year my cousin Whitney got engaged, and the entire dinner became a 2-hour conversation about venues and dress budgets, and when someone finally, almost as an afterthought, asked what was new with me, I said, not much. Because the true answer, that I'd spent 6 months coordinating intelligence support for a partner force operation that prevented a coordinated attack on a civilian population center, didn't fit inside a Thanksgiving pause between the mashed potatoes and the pie. I stopped correcting the record somewhere around year 4. It was easier, I told myself, to let them have their story. Easier to be the footnote than to keep offering the truth to people who'd already decided in advance they didn't want it. I see now that some of that was self-protection dressed up as maturity. If you never hand someone the real version of you, they can never reject it. It's a strange kind of safety, built entirely out of withholding, and I lived inside it for a decade without ever quite naming what it cost me. Gordon filed the contest 6 weeks after the will reading. He hired Preston Duke, a probate litigator known around the county courthouse for exactly one specialty: making elderly decedents look confused and their unexpected heirs look predatory. It was, by all accounts, an efficient and profitable little practice. What Gordon didn't understand, what he genuinely, I believe, never once considered, was that discovery cuts both ways. "He's subpoenaing your personnel file," Sarah told me over coffee, sliding a stack of paper across the table with the particular grimness of a lawyer who has just found something that's going to blow up in the other side's face. Not through proper Army channels, through a records broker Duke's firm uses for civil litigation. This guy is trying to get medical and psychiatric records through a back door that doesn't have jurisdiction over federal personnel files. I read through it twice. My stomach didn't drop the way I expected. It went cold and very still, the same stillness I used to feel staring at a threat board that had just resolved into something real. "That's a Privacy Act problem," I said. "That's a Privacy Act problem," Sarah agreed. "A pretty significant one. But she tapped the second page, "there's something else in here. Look at the letterhead on the records request." I looked. Callaway Construction and Logistics, Gordon's company, was listed as the requesting entity's referred client, which was strange because Gordon wasn't a party trying to obtain his own records. He was trying to obtain mine, using his business's retained legal service, which meant his business's compliance officer had signed off on a records request tied to ongoing litigation. Why would his construction company's legal department be involved in a probate contest against you? I asked. Sarah's expression did something I'd only seen a handful of times in 11 years of friendship: the flicker of a woman who has just found a loose thread and is trying very hard not to smile before she's sure it's real. "I don't know yet," she said, "but I know someone who might." That someone was Captain Mia Torres, a judge advocate assigned to my brigade's legal office, sharp and unflappable, the kind of officer who read regulations for fun on weekends and genuinely seemed to enjoy it. I called her that same afternoon sitting in my car in a parking lot, because some conversations you don't have inside a building with thin walls engine off. Both hands on the wheel like I was bracing for impact even though nothing had happened yet. "Walk me through it slowly," Torres said, and I did, laying out the subpoena, the records broker, the strange letterhead, while she made small acknowledging sounds on the other end that told me she was taking notes. "They can't access your service record that way," Torres said flatly, once I'd explained it. "Privacy Act protections on federal personnel records don't bend just because someone's suing your relative." If Duke's firm actually pulled anything through that broker, that's a federal violation. And frankly, ma'am, I'd be very curious what a general contractor's compliance office is doing anywhere near a records request like that. You think there's something else going on? I think, Torres said carefully, that when somebody's construction company gets nervous enough to send lawyers digging into a family member's federal file during an unrelated probate case, it's usually not curiosity. It's cover. I sat with that for a moment, watching a woman push a shopping cart across the parking lot outside my windshield, ordinary Tuesday afternoon life going on around me, while my own family quietly detonated somewhere behind the scenes. What do I do with that? I asked. Legally, right now, nothing, Torres said. You don't go digging into his business. That's not your fight. And frankly, ma'am, it would look exactly like what he's accusing you of, using information you're not supposed to have to get an advantage in a civil case. What you do is make sure your own house is clean and your own records are correctly and lawfully in evidence. If there's something rotten on his end, it'll surface on its own once the right people start looking. You don't have to be the one holding a flashlight. It was good advice, the kind of advice that required more patience than I had reserves for most days, but I'd spent enough years trusting slow, careful process over the satisfying rush of taking matters into my own hands to know she was right. Sarah, for her part, hired a private investigator named Coleman, a retired federal auditor, who spoke in the clipped, unbothered cadence of a man who had spent 30 years reading spreadsheets for a living and found nothing in the world particularly shocking anymore. Coleman spent 11 days pulling public federal contracting records. Nothing exotic, nothing that required special access, just the same searchable database any citizen could query if they knew where to look and what questions to ask. He found the pattern in an afternoon. 4 contracts, he told Sarah over the phone, on a call she later read back to me nearly verbatim because she wanted me to hear exactly how plainly it had all been sitting there. All 4 flagged service-disabled veteran-owned small business status. All 4 list a Raymond Doss as the qualifying majority owner. Public disability rating is on file with the VA. Easy enough to find in the aggregate award data, even without touching anything private. But every single contract manager listed on the actual project paperwork, every signature on every change order, every dollar of payroll, it all traces back to Gordon Calloway. He'd paused, and Sarah said she could practically hear him shrug through the phone. Doss doesn't run that company. He signs for it. There's a difference, and the federal government cares a great deal about that difference. I cleared my throat, because the pieces were starting to move into a shape I recognized, not from courtrooms, but from years of watching disparate signals suddenly resolve into a single coherent threat. Cover for what? I asked. That, Torres said, is somebody else's investigation to run. But if I were you, I'd mention to your civil counsel that federal contracting fraud referrals exist for a reason, and DCIS doesn't need much of an excuse to open a file. The reason turned out to be simpler and uglier than any of us guessed. Callaway Construction and Logistics had for the past 4 years been winning federal infrastructure contracts set aside specifically for service-disabled veteran-owned small businesses, a designation that came with real advantages in federal bidding, real money, real preference points that other companies couldn't touch. Gordon had never served a day in uniform. The SDVOSB status was registered under a managing partner named Ray Doss, a man Gordon paid a modest monthly retainer to sign paperwork and occasionally show up to site visits in a company polo. Doss had a service-connected disability rating from a National Guard deployment 2 decades earlier, and on paper, that made him the qualifying owner. In practice, according to the contracting documents Sarah's investigator eventually pulled, Doss had no operational control over the company, no equity beyond a token percentage, and no involvement in any bid hire or business decision Callaway Construction had made in the last 3 years. It's called a rent-a-vet arrangement, and it is, under federal law, fraud. Specifically, it's a false certification under the Small Business Act, and depending on how the contracts were represented in billing, it can trigger liability under the False Claims Act, the same law that lets whistleblowers and federal investigators claw back money obtained through fraudulent government contracts with penalties that stack fast. None of us went looking for it. Gordon's own lawyers, digging for ammunition against me, had kicked open the door themselves. The night before the hearing, I sat on my grandfather's porch, my porch now, though I still hadn't fully let myself believe that, and looked out at the 11 acres Gordon had already been telling developers he'd subdivide. My grandfather, Command Sergeant Major Walter Callaway, retired, had been the only person in my family who ever asked me a real question about my work instead of assuming an answer. He never pushed past what I could say. He just asked, every visit, the same simple question. "You doing good work, Ren?" And when I said yes, he'd nod, satisfied, the way Okafor used to nod, like the answer was enough because he trusted the person giving it. He'd been my emergency contact on every deployment form I'd ever filled out. He was the one who got the call the night I was wounded, the one who sat in a hospital waiting room in Landstuhl, Germany for 11 hours because he refused to leave, the one who promised me, holding my hand while I was still half under from the anesthesia, that he wouldn't tell my mother or Gordon anything beyond "she's stable" until I decided what I wanted them to know. I never decided. Silence, once you've practiced it long enough, becomes its own kind of shelter. I told myself I was protecting operational details. Some of that was true, but if I'm honest, and I've had a year now to be honest with myself about it, some of it was simpler than that. I didn't want to hand my family a story they'd only use to keep patting me on the head, dressed up this time as pity instead of dismissal. My grandfather understood that better than anyone. It's why he left me the house instead of a single dollar of the liquid accounts Gordon was so desperate for. He didn't need me to prove anything to him. He'd already seen it. The year I came home on convalescent leave, and he sat with me on this same porch and simply said, "I know what kind of work leaves that kind of scar, kiddo. You don't have to tell me. I already know you did it right." He was the only signature line in my life that never required an explanation. He had his own reasons for understanding silence, ones I only pieced together slowly, the way you piece together a man's whole life from the fragments he let slip during long, unhurried evenings on a porch. He'd served 31 years, enlisted at 17, with a forged permission slip and a recruiter who didn't look too closely, and retired as a command sergeant major after 2 tours in places that, at the time, weren't supposed to have American boots on the ground at all. He never talked about specifics. He talked instead in the shape of lessons, the way career soldiers of his generation often did, stories with the hard edges filed down until only the useful part remained. "You know the hardest order I ever gave?" he asked me once, the same year I made captain, both of us sitting on this porch with 2 fingers of bourbon we barely touched. Wasn't in combat. It was telling a young private's mother over the phone that I couldn't tell her where her son was or what he was doing, only that he was alive and he was proud of the work, and that she was going to have to trust me on both counts. He'd turned his glass slowly in the porch light. She hung up on me, called back 20 minutes later and apologized, said she just needed a minute to be angry at something she couldn't see. He looked at me then, steady. "That's the job, Ren, not just the part where you carry the secret. The part where you let the people who love you be angry at the shape of it, and you don't take that anger personally, because it was never really about you. It's about the not knowing. People hate not knowing more than they hate almost anything else." I didn't understand what he meant, not fully, until years later, standing in my own kitchen, listening to Gordon call me a leech over the phone during a will contest, feeling the old childhood sting of it, and then, for the first time, feeling something else underneath the sting, the recognition that Gordon's anger wasn't really about me at all. It was about a shape he couldn't see, a life he decided not to ask about because the not asking was easier than sitting with his own not knowing. My grandfather had tried gently for years to get Gordon to see it too. "Let her be who she is, David," he told him once. Gordon's middle name was David, and my grandfather only used it when he meant to be taken seriously. I'd overheard it from the kitchen, the 2 of them out on the same porch. "You don't have to understand her work to respect her. You just have to stop deciding you already know everything about her because she doesn't talk the way you do." Gordon had laughed it off that night too. He laughed off most things that asked something of him. The night before the hearing, Sarah came over with takeout containers and a legal pad covered in her small, precise handwriting, and we sat at my grandfather's kitchen table going through the exhibit list one more time. "I want to be straight with you about something," she said, setting down her chopsticks. "Whitfield's going to react to that uniform. Judges aren't supposed to be swayed by anything but the law, and most of them genuinely try not to be. But he's a person before he's a robe. And a courtroom full of people calling a decorated combat veteran unstable and unemployable is going to land on him the way it would land on anyone with a conscience. That's not strategy, Ren. That's just true. But I need you to understand, I'm not asking you to wear it as a performance. I'm asking you to wear it because it's honest. And honesty is the only thing Duke's entire case doesn't have." "I know," I said. "I've thought about it a lot. I spent 10 years letting my family believe whatever was easiest for them. I'm not interested in doing that inside a courtroom, too. Sarah studied me for a second. The particular look she got when she was deciding whether to say something as a lawyer or as a friend. For what it's worth, she said finally, I've known you 11 years, and this is maybe the third time you've ever really let me see what any of it cost you. The medal, the scar, any of it. You don't have to keep doing that just because tomorrow's a big day, but I wanted you to know I noticed, and I'm glad you let me. I didn't trust my voice for a second, so I just nodded and reached for the rice. The morning of the hearing, I put on my Army service uniform, the dark blue one with the rows of ribbons I almost never wore outside a formal ceremony. Sarah met my eyes when I walked into her office and said nothing about it, just nodded once, like she understood exactly what I was doing and why. I wasn't wearing it for drama. I was wearing it because Torres had explained calmly and precisely that public displays of decorations aren't classified, aren't dramatic reveals, aren't secrets. They're simply true, verifiable, and available to anyone who bothers to look. Gordon's lawyer had spent 2 months building a case on the assumption that nobody would look. I decided to make looking unavoidable. Preston Duke didn't notice at first. He was too busy delivering his closing argument, pacing in front of the bench with the easy confidence of a man who'd already mentally spent his fee. Your Honor, we have proven this woman has no stable employment history, that she is willing to disclose no verified income beyond a nondescript government stipend, documented psychiatric care following what appears to be a significant trauma, and absolutely no evidence of the close relationship necessary to justify inheriting an 11-acre estate over her own uncle, a lifelong devoted family member. He gestured toward Gordon, who nodded gravely, playing the part of the wounded patriarch with real conviction. We ask this court to set aside the codicil and return the estate to its rightful distribution. Judge Whitfield looked at Sarah. Rebuttal? Counsel? Sarah rose. Your Honor, opposing counsel has characterized my client's federal employment as, quote, nondescript. We'd like to enter a certified copy of her DD Form 214 and her most recent officer evaluation report into evidence, both obtained through proper Army records channels with my client's written consent. The bailiff carried the folder up. Judge Whitfield opened it, and that was the moment I described earlier, the moment his face changed, the moment the room went still. He read the page a second time before he spoke, and when he finally looked up, he didn't look at Sarah or at Duke. He looked at me, sitting there in dress blues with the ribbons I never explained at family dinners. Major Calloway, he said, would you mind standing? I stood. Sarah stood beside me. This document, Judge Whitfield said, addressing the courtroom, confirms that the respondent holds the rank of Major in the United States Army, with a decorated combat record including a Purple Heart and a Bronze Star with Valor device for actions in 2019. It is a public record, filed with the Department of Defense, available to anyone through the appropriate channels. Opposing counsel's characterization of her employment as, and I'm quoting, the filing nondescript and unverifiable, is directly contradicted by material that was available to his office the entire time. Had they chosen to conduct that basic diligence rather than commission an unauthorized attempt to obtain her federal medical records through a private broker? Duke's face went white. Gordon's mouth opened and nothing came out for a full 3 seconds. Your Honor, Duke started. I'm not finished, counsel. Whitfield's voice sharpened. This court has also received a referral through the respondent's attorney regarding an active federal investigation into the plaintiff's construction company for potential violations of the Small Business Act and possible False Claims Act exposure related to fraudulent SD Vosby certification. I have no jurisdiction over that matter, and I want to be clear that this court is not adjudicating it today. But I am taking judicial notice of the fact that the plaintiff's attempt to obtain protected federal records through an improper channel appears to have exposed his own company to federal scrutiny that had nothing whatsoever to do with this case. Until his legal team went looking for leverage in exactly the wrong place. A strangled sound came from Gordon's side of the room. Blake, sitting behind his father, had gone rigid, staring at the back of Gordon's head like he was seeing him for the first time. Duke, to his credit or perhaps to his own undoing, wasn't finished. He'd spent 2 months building a theory of the case, and he wasn't ready to let it die quietly in front of a room he'd expected to win in front of. Your Honor, if there are documents relating to a psychiatric hospitalization in my possession, obtained through proper legal channels or otherwise, the court should still consider, counsel. Whitfield's voice went flat and hard in a way it hadn't been all morning. Do you have documents in your possession that you obtained from a federal records broker outside the scope of any subpoena this court authorized? Duke hesitated a half-second too long. Your Honor, in the course of diligent representation? Yes or no, Mr. Duke? Yes. Yes, Your Honor. Yes, Your Honor. And did this court at any point authorize the release of the respondent's protected federal medical records through that channel? No, Your Honor, but then you are in possession of records obtained in direct violation of a standing protective order this court issued at the outset of discovery, specifically barring any party from pursuing protected federal personnel information outside the formal subpoena process. Whitfield leaned forward. Do you have those documents on your person or in your files right now, counsel? Duke's hand had drifted, almost involuntarily, toward the leather folio at his elbow, and that small, unconscious motion answered the question before he could stop himself from confirming it out loud. Bailiff, secure counsel's folio. Whitfield's voice carried to every corner of the room now. Mr. Duke, you are in violation of this court's protective order, and I am holding you in contempt. We will address sanctions at a separate hearing, and I am referring this matter to the State Bar's Disciplinary Council, in addition to the referral already contemplated for the discovery violation itself. This is precisely the kind of conduct that protective order existed to prevent, and you knew that when you carried those documents into my courtroom anyway. Preston Duke's face had gone the color of old paper. Gordon stared at his own attorney like a man watching his lifeboat take on water, and for the first time all morning I saw something on his face that wasn't performance. It was fear, plain and unrehearsed. This court finds no credible evidence of undue influence, diminished capacity, or fraud in the execution of Walter Calloway's final testamentary documents, Whitfield continued. The contest is dismissed with prejudice. Furthermore, given the nature of the discovery request that improperly targeted federal personnel records, I am referring this matter to the State Bar for review of counsel's conduct. And I am imposing sanctions against the plaintiff to cover the respondent's legal fees in full. The gavel came down. The sound was small, almost ordinary, nothing like the thunderclap I'd half expected. But the courtroom deflated all the same, all the air going out of it at once, and I watched my family, my aunts, my cousins, the people who'd spent a decade calling me the family's disappointment, gather their coats and file out without once meeting my eyes. Gordon didn't move. He sat there, staring at nothing, while Duke leaned down and murmured something about appeals that Gordon didn't seem to hear. Judge Whitfield stepped down from the bench after the room cleared, no robe now. Just a tired man in a white shirt with his sleeves rolled to the elbow. He walked over to where Sarah and I were gathering our papers. Major, he said and cleared his throat. I served 2 tours before law school, 82nd Airborne. He said it simply, without ceremony, the way you'd mention where you grew up. My son's unit ran a route clearance mission in 2019 that got flagged for reroute at the last minute. Command never told them why. Just that intel caught something. He looked at me for a long moment. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that. I felt something tighten in my throat that had nothing to do with courtroom procedure. I might, I said, quietly. I couldn't say for certain without pulling a specific report. You don't have to say anything at all. He held out his hand, not the way a judge shakes a hand, but the way one veteran offers it to another. Flat, direct, no performance in it. I just wanted to shake the hand of whoever it was. Seemed like today might be my only chance. I shook it. It was firm and warm and real, and for a moment neither of us said anything else because some things don't need narration. Thank you for your service, Major, he said. And I'm sorry about the circus in there. You deserved better than having to prove it in a courtroom. With respect, sir, I said, I didn't have to prove anything. Somebody just finally had to look. He smiled at that, small and tired, and walked back toward his chambers. Gordon's collapse, when it came, didn't come from the courtroom. It came 6 weeks later in the form of a certified letter from the Small Business Administration's Office of Inspector General, followed shortly by a visit from 2 investigators with the Defense Criminal Investigative Service. Ray Doss, faced with the prospect of his own criminal exposure, cooperated fully within a week. The paper trail was, by all accounts, unusually clean for a fraud case. Invoices that Doss had never seen, meeting minutes he'd never attended, an operating agreement that gave him decision-making authority he'd never once exercised. Callaway Construction and Logistics had, over 4 years, been awarded government contracts worth just under $9 million under a certification that had never been true. Preston Duke, for his part, lost his bar license for 18 months over the records violation, a fact I learned secondhand from Torres, who tracked disciplinary filings the way some people track sports scores, not out of malice. She told me, but because it mattered to her that the system occasionally did what it was supposed to do. Watching it work, even from a distance, seemed to matter to her the way it mattered to me. I heard about the federal charges the same way most families hear bad news now, through a relative's Facebook post, this one from my aunt 3 sentences long and stripped of every detail that mattered. The kind of post written by someone still trying to protect a story that had already stopped being protectable. My mother called me that night, the first real conversation we'd had in months that wasn't logistics about the estate paperwork. "I don't understand how this happened," she said, and I could hear underneath the words that she wasn't really asking about the fraud charges. She was asking how her family had come apart so completely, so fast, over a house and a folder and a decade of unasked questions. "I think it happened slowly," I said, "and then all at once, the way most things do." She was quiet for a long moment. "I should have asked you more, over the years, about your work, about you. I let your uncle set the terms of every conversation about you because it was easier than pushing back, and I'm ashamed of that now." I didn't have a clean answer for her. "I'm still not sure I do." "You can ask me now," I said instead, and that was as close to forgiveness as either of us was ready for that night, and it turned out, in the months since, to be enough to build something new on. I didn't celebrate. I want to be honest about that, because it would make for a better ending if I told you I felt something sharp and satisfying when the news came through. Some clean, bright justice landing exactly where it belonged. What I actually felt was quieter than that. Something closer to relief, and underneath the relief something that surprised me. A kind of sadness for a man who had spent his whole life demanding to be seen as important, and who had built that importance on a foundation as hollow as the one he'd always accused me of having. 1 year later, I'm sitting on the porch of my grandfather's house, my house now, and it doesn't sound strange in my head anymore the way it did at first. The peeling paint is gone. The porch swing doesn't creak the way it used to. I spent the better part of a year with my hands in the actual dirt of this place. And somewhere in that year, the house stopped being an inheritance and started being a home. I made Lieutenant Colonel 8 months ago. The frocking paperwork finally caught up to the reality of what I'd already been doing for 2 years, which is usually how the Army does things, reality first, paperwork eventually. Diane Okafor is a full colonel now running a brigade of her own, and we still talk most weeks. Less like a former commander and subordinate and more like two people who once trusted each other with the kind of decisions that don't allow for second guessing. "Good call, ma'am," she told me on the phone last month when I flagged an inconsistency in a threat assessment that turned out to matter. It still lands the same way it did the first time she said it, standing behind me in that operations center outside Kandahar, quiet, solid, enough. I built something here that Gordon never understood existed, and honestly, for most of my adult life, I never fully articulated it either, not even to myself. It isn't a family bound by blood or by the ledger of who got what at Thanksgiving. It's a family built on people who have trusted me with decisions that mattered when it counted, and who I've trusted the same way in return. Okafor, who never once asked me to explain myself before believing my read on a threat board. Torres, who spent hours of her own time making sure the truth got in front of a judge the right way. Through the front door, not a side one. Sarah, who has sat with me through 11 years of a friendship that never once required me to perform anything I wasn't. Whitfield, a stranger for exactly 1 morning, who looked at a piece of paper and understood, faster than my own family ever managed to, exactly who I was. Some evenings, I still catch myself waiting for the old knot in my stomach. The Thanksgiving reflex, the bracing for the joke about the cubicle and the gift card. It doesn't come anymore. I used to think that absence would feel like triumph. It doesn't, not really. It feels more like a held breath finally let go. The ordinary, unremarkable relief of a body that has finally stopped preparing for an attack that isn't coming. My grandfather's photo sits on the desk in what used to be his study and is now mine. Him in his dress uniform, Command Sergeant Major, chevrons on his sleeve. a look on his face like a man who already knew every secret his granddaughter would ever carry and had decided a long time before I ever needed him to that he trusted her with all of it. Blake reached out a few months ago, not Gordon. Gordon's federal case is still working its way through pre-trial motions. And I understand, through channels I don't examine too closely, that the family's finances have not survived the process intact. Blake's message was short, awkward, the kind of text someone writes 4 times before sending. I didn't know about any of it. I'm sorry we made you sit through years of that. I read it twice. I felt my eyes sting a little, not from anger this time, but from something gentler. The recognition that at least one person in that family had finally been willing to look. I wrote back 3 words. Thank you, Blake. I didn't need more than that, and I don't think he expected more than that either. I never heard from Gordon directly. I heard, secondhand, through my aunt's careful phrasing, that he'd asked whether I might consider helping with legal costs, given everything the family's been through. I read the message once, waited for the old knot to tighten in my stomach the way it always used to at Thanksgiving, the reflex 2 decades in the making. Nothing came. Not coldness, exactly. Just quiet. The kind of quiet that comes after a long deployment, when the adrenaline finally drains out of your system and what's left underneath is simply peace. Plain and unremarkable and entirely your own. I didn't reply to that message either. I archived it the way I archive most things now that no longer require my attention and turned back to the report open on my laptop. A new threat pattern from a new region that needed my eyes before end of day. My work still isn't the kind you can explain at a dinner table. Most of it never will be. But I'd stopped needing anyone at that table to understand it in order for it to matter. The medal in the drawer, the scar on my hip, the quiet nod from a commander who trusted my read on a threat board over her own gut. None of it needed an audience to be real. It just needed to be true. Gordon spent his whole life demanding the world hand him proof of his own importance. A title, a toast, a number in an account. In the end, his entire world came apart not because anyone set out to destroy it, but because he went looking for a weapon to use against the one person in his family who had never once asked him for anything, and found instead the exact evidence of his own fraud, sitting right where he'd left it waiting for someone to bother to look. I used to think silence was something I owed my country. Some of it, I did. But I've come to understand something else in the years since that porch swing stopped creaking. Silence isn't just a shield you carry for other people's secrets. Sometimes it's the space you build for your own peace, the room where nobody else's opinion of you gets to live rent-free anymore. If you've ever had to sit quietly while people who claim to love you decided who you were without asking, I hope you find your own version of that courtroom moment, not the drama of it, not the vindication, but the simple, ordinary relief of finally being seen for exactly what you always were, whether anyone claps for it or not. I laugh sometimes now thinking about Duke pacing in front of that bench, so certain he'd already won, so certain that a woman who kept quiet had nothing worth hearing. He wasn't wrong that I'd built a life out of things nobody could see. He was only wrong about what that meant. Invisible and unimportant were never the same thing, no matter how many Thanksgivings my family spent conflating the two. The sun's going down now over the 11 acres my grandfather left me, the ones Gordon wanted to carve into lots and sell to the highest bidder. The porch light catches the edge of his photo through the study window behind me. The dress uniform, the steady eyes, the man who never once needed an explanation to know exactly who I was. I think he'd tell me the same thing he always told me, if he were still here to say it. You did good, kiddo, whatever it was. I don't need to know what. I already know you did it right. I finished my coffee. I closed the laptop. Tomorrow there's a briefing at 0600, a new pattern in the data that needs my eyes before anyone above me signs off on what it means. Nobody will clap for it. Nobody outside a small, windowless room will ever know it happened at all. That's fine. That was always the job. And for the first time in longer than I can easily remember, it's also, simply and completely, my own.